Good morning, this is Tim Hammer, pastor of Saline Baptist Church, the community of Tull outside of Benton, with your morning devotion taken from the book of Numbers, chapter 12. In the preceding chapter, that was where the people had complained about being on the vegetarian diet and they wanted meat, even though they were sacrificing and they were getting a portion of meat from the sacrifice, yet it wasn't enough to satisfy them. And so they started complaining, and the problem was they were complaining about the Lord and not to the Lord, and He heard them. And He heard their tone, He heard their heart, and as a result of it, they received punishment, and that He sent them quail that equivalated to about 450 pounds per person for the day. And as a result of it, we find that that was more than they could consume. It turned into rotting meat, and they had to pick up a net, and they had to move. So God had displayed through Moses His power. Now you would think that by this time, as much time as Moses had been before the people, that everybody would have got the point that Moses is the leader and God has His hand on Moses. You would have thought that would have been the case for all the people, and especially his family. But when you go into chapter 12, you find that his brother and his sister, and I'm going to read you the first 3 verses. It says, Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he married a Cushite. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses, they asked? Hasn't He also spoken through us? And the Lord heard this. Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. Now, Miriam and Aaron were not talking to Moses about the marital situation he had with his wife. They were talking about Moses behind his back. And just like God heard the people as they were talking about his back in chapter 11, we find in chapter 12, as Miriam and Aaron were talking about Moses, God's appointed person, behind his back, God still heard them. You'd think they would have learned the lesson, but you know, sometimes we as human beings, it takes a long time, and sometimes it even takes a real catastrophic event in our life for us to finally get the point of what God is trying to tell us. And such is the case is going to happen in chapter 12. Miriam was the older sister of Moses. Aaron was the older brother of Moses. Miriam was a prophetess. Aaron was a prophet. Moses was the youngest, or the baby, of the family to both of these siblings, Miriam and Aaron. Now Moses married a Cushite woman. That is correct, because you go back to the book of Exodus chapter 2 and verse 21, his wife's name was Zipporah. And you may remember that it was after Moses left Egypt, having killed the Egyptian, and when he came into the country among the Midianites, he came upon a situation. There were girls that were watering a flock, and some of the other shepherds came in and ran the girls off and were being abusive to them, and Moses stepped in and protected them, and they invited him to go home, and there were, I forgot how many of them, but there was a slew of daughters there. And anyway, Zipporah's daddy, Jethro, gave one of the daughters, Zipporah, to Moses as his wife. So that goes back to Exodus chapter 2, verse 21. Now, the reason I say that is I want you to think about how much has passed since Numbers chapter 12 and when Moses married this woman. Moses had the burning bush experience. Aaron was appointed to help Moses in Exodus chapter 4 and verse 14. They've dealt with the 10 plagues. They've dealt with the Exodus, the Red Sea crossing, water coming out of the rock. Miriam, in chapter 15, chapter 15 of the book of Exodus, she sings, the entire chapter is about the song that she sings, celebrating how that God had delivered them from the Egyptians when they crossed the Red Sea. They've been through the whole manna thing where God had provided manna to them. Where Zipporah was reunited with Moses, and that's in Exodus chapter 18, and that's where Jethro told Moses, hey, you're doing too much, you need to have some help here. And so they get all that done. Then they got the Mount Sinai experience, the 10 Commandments, the establishing of the law, the building of the tabernacle, and Aaron and the golden calf experience. You think you would have learned something out of that, but Aaron and the golden calf experience while Moses was up getting the 10 Commandments. They go through all the different kinds of offerings that were established, the burnt offering, the sin offering, the Thanksgiving offering, all those. There's been a minimum of 2+ years, probably more like 3 to 4 years worth of time that Aaron and Moses and Miriam have been working together, and at least somewhere around 2 years at least that Moses has been married to this woman, probably longer. And so all of a sudden here in chapter 12, now it becomes an issue. After all that experience, now it becomes an issue. And they pick on Moses for the wife that he married. And the reason I'm laying that groundwork like that is because the real issue wasn't who he married. That's just what they used as an excuse. And that's the way people do today sometimes too. They'll pick something as an excuse to attack somebody else, and it really has nothing to do with what they're attacking that person for. They're just using it as a shield or an end around to get to what the real problem was. In the case of Miriam and Aaron, you find out what the real problem is. It's not his wife, because if they'd had problems with her, it would have been mentioned a long time ago. Now, Moses is their baby brother. They probably think that they know best, all that stuff. I get it. But look at what happened in chapter 2, because this is where it reveals what the real problem was. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses, they asked? Hasn't he also spoken through us? Jealousy was the problem. It wasn't who Moses was married to. That's insignificant at this point. With as much under the belt as they've had in way of experiences, that's not the problem. The problem is that they were jealous of Moses, that God was using him so much. Now remember, Miriam was a prophetess. Aaron was a prophet. And we find that God speaks to you, because as you read on, you'll find that God approaches them in that manner. Now before he does, in verse 4, the Lord, and one thing I want you to notice is in verse 2, it says, and the Lord heard this. Just like the Lord heard the people talking behind Moses' back in chapter 11, he heard Miriam and Aaron talking behind Moses' back in chapter 12. And God is going to deal with it the same way. God punished the Israelites in chapter 11. He's about to punish Miriam and Aaron as well. And so he calls them out. Now, I'd use the illustration that God called them out to the woodshed, kind of like Daddy called them out to the woodshed. He said to Moses and Aaron and Miriam, get out to the tent of meeting, all three of you. I mean, if your parents were disciplinarians, you could probably replay this in your mind. It'd be like your mama saying, get out here and get out here now. That's kind of the attitude that God had with these three at this time, because he was going to take them to the woodshed, and somebody was going to get taught a lesson for what they did that was wrong. And so God comes down and he meets with them, and this is what he says in verses 6 through 8. He said, when a prophet of the Lord is among you, I reveal myself to him in visions, I speak to him in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I have spoken face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? He's talking to Miriam and to Aaron. He's identifying the fact that when I speak to you as a prophet and a prophetess, I speak to you in a different way. But when I speak to Moses, I speak to him face to face. He had a different relationship with God, and I think a lot of it goes back to what was mentioned about him in verse 3, and that's because Moses was the most humble person on the face of the earth. Why did God choose Moses in the first place? I think God chose Moses in the first place because of that quality mentioned right there, because God can do something with a humble person, but somebody like Miriam and Aaron, he has to break them down first. He got right to it with Moses because Moses had that humble spirit about him that God could use, and that's a great quality. I know we look at people that are humble today and we think they're weak, we think they're pushover, we don't think they're leaders, we don't think a lot of good stuff about them. We kind of discount them. God looks at it as the highest quality that he could see in a person when he calls them to do a special job, if they have that spirit of humbleness, because pride goeth before destruction, but humility is something that the Lord can use. So he said of Moses that he is his servant, number one. Number two, he is faithful. And number three, he is a servant and faithful in all my house. In other words, everywhere I can look, Moses is at the top of the list. He gets the face-to-face conversation with me, and he gets direct access to me. Now, God told him, he said, now you have spoken against Moses, and you maybe didn't think I heard you, but I did hear you. I don't know if any of y'all have lived in one of those houses where you said something and the walls had ears, or mama had eyes in the back of her head, or she could hear a mile away. I mean, it was no different than this. God is everywhere, and he can hear everything, and he heard exactly what they said. And the anger of the Lord burned against them. And in verse 9 it says he left him. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation as a child growing up where your parents got so mad that they had to leave before they came back to punish you, because they got so mad they knew if they beat you then, you'd probably be beaten within an inch of your life. But I think that's why God left him, because if God had not left him, he would have killed him. So God went away and he cooled down a little bit, but that didn't mean he was done with them. He came back, and we find what happened was in verse 10, when the cloud lifted from above the tent, Miriam was there leprous, and she was leprous like snow. And when Aaron turned and saw her, he melted, and he pleaded with Moses. Interesting, he went to Moses, and he didn't go to God first. He went to Moses, and he pleaded for forgiveness. In fact, he acknowledged, he said, we've sinned against you. Forgive us and intervene on our behalf between us and God, that we might seek forgiveness. You know, in that moment, in that role, in that place, Moses was fulfilling the role of what Jesus does for you and I. Whenever it is that we violate God and we sin against God, Jesus is our intercessor, the Bible says. And we go to him seeking forgiveness of our sin, that he might intervene on our behalf between us and righteous and holy God. And that's the important role of Jesus. And in this role, Moses was playing the role of Jesus, in that they went to him and asked him for forgiveness. Now, Moses didn't have the power to forgive them only in the sibling relationship, but he did beg on behalf of their benefit to God. And God said, you know what? Even if she just spit in her daddy's face, she'd have to spend 7 days out in the wilderness outside the camp. She's at least going to get that punishment. So for 7 days, she got sentenced outside the camp to deal with her leprous experience and to think about what she did before she came back in the camp. It wasn't the first time Moses had to deal with a leprous experience. You remember back whenever it was that God was trying to convince him, he wanted him to be the leader. And, you know, when you read chapter 12 and verse 3 and you look back to the experience when God was calling Moses to be a servant, Moses kept saying, no, I can't do it. You know, sometimes you wonder back then if he was playing cat and mouse. I think really Moses had a inferiority, now that's not the right word, but you know what I mean. He had an inferior complex where he felt that he wasn't significant enough or important enough to do what God wanted to do, but in reality, he was exactly what God wanted, in the way of somebody that he could develop and lead, and later we find out why. So when you look back, you see that Moses really was the person. But God, when Moses was trying to reject God's offer to be his servant, he stuck his hand in his coat, he pulled it out, and what did it come out? It came out leprous. He put his hand back in, he brought it back out. It became what? Normal. Moses was understanding of this situation. He understood the position that Miriam was in, and he had compassion for her, and he advocated on her behalf and Aaron's behalf so that God would forgive and restore, and they could move on. We find later that's all there is. You go of Miriam, you go to chapter 20 and verse 1, and you find out that she dies, and she's not mentioned anymore between chapter 12 and chapter 20. Her role was fulfilled, and she was no longer referenced, except for you go over to the book of Micah, chapter 6 and verse 4, and God references her, though, and he says, I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you along with Aaron and Miriam, Micah chapter 6 and verse 4. Why she had a bleak moment in her life, it didn't define her. God still found it worthy to mention her later in the prophets in the book of Micah chapter 6 and verse 4, that she did play a significant role. Here's some things you can take away from today. Recognize that God is in control, and he has us all where he wants us to be. So let's not be talking about each other. Let's just find our place, do our thing that God gave us to do, because he's hearing everything we're saying. Don't be jealous because somebody else is doing something that you're not getting to do, because you're getting to do something they're not getting to do. So just focus on who you are and how God can condition you to make you better at what he's called you to do. Seek forgiveness from those who offend you and ask God to forgive you, because we don't need to have those kind of relationships among Christianity. It only gives the world on the outside a reason to criticize us on the inside. Remember also there's consequences for your actions, just like Miriam and Aaron experienced, that God will not let any sin go unpunished. So ask him to forgive you, because there are consequences for your actions, and the severer the consequences, or the severer the actions, the more severe the consequences. And then finally, use everything for a teachable moment. It's going to be interesting. We get in the next few chapters that where Aaron was standing against Moses and talking bad about him, Aaron will find himself in exactly the same spot side by side with Moses as the people now rise up against both of them. And because of this experience here in chapter 12, we find that Aaron is going to be a little bit stronger, a little bit better leader. But had he not experienced this, he would not have been prepared for what's coming. Hope you have a great day, and thanks for listening this morning. This is Kim Hammer, pastor of Saline Baptist Church in Tull.